Greetings everyone. Welcome to yet another interactive session hosted by Caucus, the discussion forum of Hindu College. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Joel Mokyr with us on the theme Understanding the Cultural Foundations of Economic Prosperity. Professor Joel Mokyr is a distinguished economic historian and academic holding the positions of Professor of Economics and History and the Robert H. Strotz Professor of Arts and Sciences at Northwestern University since 1994. He also serves as the Sackler Professorial Fellow at the Eitan Berglas School of Economics, Tel Aviv University, a role he has held since 2001. Professor Mokyr earned his PhD from Yale University, where his groundbreaking dissertation, Industrial Growth and Stagnation in the Low Countries 1800 to 1815, established him as a leading scholar in this field. Renowned for his expertise on the economic history of technological innovation, change, and industrial development, Professor Mokyr has been honored with numerous awards, including the Searle Foundation Grant, the BFS Grant, and the prestigious Jonathan Hughes Prize for excellence in the teaching of economic history, and he has been conferred by the Economic History Association. His influential publications include Why Britain, A New View of Industrial Revolution, and Two Paths to Prosperity, Culture and Institutions in Europe and China, which have significantly shaped our understanding of the interplay between culture, institutions, and economic development. We welcome you, sir. I now pass the baton to our esteemed president, Mr. Pushpal Pandey, to take the session forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anya. So I'll just say a couple of sentences about Caucus, our society, and then we'll start straight away with our discussion. Caucus was formed in 2007, and we started off initially with a focus on international relations. But 17 years is a long time, and since then we have ventured out to exploring other topics as well, economics, development, public policy in all its facets. And this year, in this academic session, we have tried in the odd semester to explore different aspects or different explanations of how economic growth actually occurs. Institutional explanations, cultural explanations, geographical explanations. And today I am grateful that Professor Mokyr agreed to talk to us today. One thing that Anya did not mention that I'll add is that Professor Mokyr has curated the definitive introduction to the economic history of the Western world. I won't blame Anya for not mentioning it, but it is the standard, at least as far as I've tried to understand topics that I wanted to read about. It contains pretty much everything that you want to learn. So thank you so much, sir, for curating that list. And thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us today. And as an introductory question, which is slightly broad, one thing that I've noticed about economic historians, several of the economic historians, Robert Allen, yourself, Cormac O'Grada, and several other theoreticians and economic historians that we have read about, is that they studied economics at their undergraduate level instead of studying history at the undergraduate level, and then they started to branch off to studying economic history. So could you tell us a bit about why you traversed the trajectory that you chose academically?
Well, if you want to become an economic historian in this day and age, you really are very likely to enter it from economics. Very few people enter it from history. And there are many reasons for that. But basically, the main reason is that today's economic history is very much based on data and theory. And without having a good training in econometrics and in statistics and in economic analysis, you really can't play this game anymore. If you go look at the journals, you look at the books that we're publishing, they are written by and large, by and for social scientists. And of those social scientists, the economists are the majority. There are a few people who come from political science, but I would say the majority are coming from economics. Very few actually come from history. And I think the main reason is I think that the history discipline, both I think in the United States and in Europe, has become less and less interested in quantitative stuff. And the kind of theory that they have in mind is very, very different than the kind of theory that economists are thinking about. Indeed, apart from sharing the word theory, I don't think there's anything in common between what an historian would call theory and what an economist will call theory. And my sense is if you want to understand major historical phenomena that are of interest, all the way from things like the Industrial Revolution to the sort of, rise and fall of inequality, of, the importance of trade, banking, money, government finance, on and on and on. You really have to come from economics and have an economics background. And so in my career, I have trained approximately 60 PhD students in the years I've been here at Northwestern. And I say of those, I would think probably 55 were in economics and 4 or 5 were in history. And it's also true, of course, that in today's academic market, economics is still very large and attracts a lot of students, whereas history and the other humanities are struggling. And so, which means that if you come out of a history department with a PhD, it's very hard to find a job because, history departments aren't growing and therefore aren't hiring very much. And so, so there are always some jobs, and the very best, the real superstars, still end up getting jobs. But it is getting harder and harder to place, as we call it, place our new PhDs in history. And obviously that is significant as well. And so by and large, I think people you mentioned, but they're both good friends of mine, by the way. Cormac is my co-author, and Bob Allen I've known for, half a century. And these people all come from economics. And if you look at the people publishing in journals like the Economic History Review or the Journal of Economic History, I would say somewhere, more than 3/4 of them, at the very least, are employed in economics department. Me too. I started off working for the economics department, and then fairly soon, because I'm so interested in history, the people in history came to me and asked me if I would be willing to join their department. And so I am a member of that department, but I would say the colleagues that I talk to and that are close to me are by and large either in economics or in business schools. That's just the reality on the ground today, and there's not much anybody can do to change it.
Thank you so much, sir. That's actually very true. And having studied history for over 2 years by now, it's evident that even while studying economic history, a lot of the graphs that are there in the textbooks are just completely skipped. So it's true. There is a
and I'll tell you one more thing, Pushkar. I mean, there are also, I think, ideological differences between, and I shouldn't generalize here because these are both, heterogeneous populations. But by and large, if you take a random economic historian from economics today, and you asked him about capitalism, and you took a historian and you asked him about capitalism, you'd get very different approaches. I think there is a presumption among most historians, that capitalism is a bad thing. That it exploits people, that it is responsible for racism, colonialism, imperialism, sexism, you name it. I mean, all the bad things, they are traced back to capitalism. And I think an economist, basically, I don't think we are all, great fans of the capitalist system, but we don't think it's either good or bad. It's something that's just there. And in some cases did some good things, and in some cases may have done some bad things. But by and large, I don't think that we feel the need to be judgmental about capitalism. We describe it. We try to see, where it came from, what it did, how it changed over time, without saying these were evil people, they were, criminal. I mean, that's not the culture in among economists. We are, and I don't think we are nearly as ideologically, permeated by a sense of justice and need for equality. I mean, you see people. Inequality is a good thing to talk about, because for people in history as well as in other social sciences, basically, inequality is always a bad thing. And for economists, I mean, it's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just something that's there. You want to explain why it is. You want to measure it. You want to, and in some cases, to be sure, extreme inequality, if it leads to, abject poverty next to, great luxury, they probably say, well, things would be better off, if inequality went down. But by and large, I think most economists understand that inequality is a fact of life that's going to be inherent in human society. And, that it's not a matter of judgment. It's a matter of analysis, of measurement, of understanding. That's a different approach. And I'm not sure which one is better. It's just reflect the different cultures of the two disciplines.
Interestingly, we hosted Professor Tirthankar Roy of the London School of Economics for a session earlier this year.
I know him.
I know that Professor Roy has gotten into several conflicts and controversies with the mainstream history-oriented, let's say, economic historians, which are sometimes called, quote-unquote, nationalist Marxist historians. So they talk about the Great Drain, they talk about deindustrialization and several other deurbanization and several other factors. And I've sneaked in a couple of questions for that later, if they fit in today's conversations. One thing that you mentioned and that I found interesting is a distinction between theory in both the disciplines. And I was reading a book recently called Modeling the Middle Ages by Mark Bailey and John Hatcher, and he sort of discussed all the broad models of growth that have emerged: Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Malthus, Ricardo, and all the others. So in this conversation, I'd like it if we take some of them one by one and then sort of proceed to discussing the cultural theory, or the theory or the hypothesis that you presented in the culture of growth. So the first question that comes to my mind: culturally, when we look at different societies across history, would it be fair, and if yes, to what extent, to say that humans have an innate propensity to engage in trade? Because and one dispute that comes to mind is when Polanyi said that you can't really impose modern economic concepts to pre-modern times because people didn't have the same dispositions and the same inclinations. So how do you evaluate, let's say, quote-unquote, a Smithian approach to writing economic history, which sort of presupposes that humans have an inclination to engage in trade and exchange?
I think it's an interesting question. Wherever you look back in history, going back, not just to the Middle Ages, you can go back to, the time of Alexander the Great and look at what he found in Asia when he went through Persia and arrived all the way to India, what we know about China at the time, what we know about even but the little we know about Mesoamerica and everyone was engaging in trade. I mean, people are predisposed to engage in trade for the simple reason that trade between consensual adult, voluntary people is making everybody better off. Okay, this is an insight that we have had basically since Adam Smith, in which he pointed this out, and eventually Ricardo and everybody else came around and say, yeah, well, it's so, So trade between two individuals or two villages or two regions or two economies, okay, by and large, in most cases, makes both sides better off because the principle of comparative advantage is really one of the sort of building blocks of economics. I'm good at this. I'm good in teaching economics, okay? My dentist is good in fixing teeth, okay? Therefore, I trade with him, I teach his children economics and he fixes my teeth. I mean, this is an absurd example, but you get the idea, right? He's good at one thing, I'm good at another. The same would be true in zillions of other things. Some countries are good at making wine. Some countries are good at growing wheat, so they trade wine for wheat. Everybody's better off. That's fundamental. Now, but why is it then that people always argue about trade? And one answer, I think, is that in order to be sustained, trade needs a particular institutional environment. So every trade, whether I buy, an ice cream in an ice cream store or I buy a house, basically involves a contract. Some contracts are written, some contracts are implicit, but they're there. And the contract basically says, you give me an ice cream and I give you $5, okay? That's how it works. Okay, now, behind that is an institution that says, if I take the ice cream and I don't pay the $5 and I run away, there will be some penalty, some chance of some sanctions that's taken against me. And therefore, actually, the transaction can take place. If the ice cream vendor thinks that there is a 75% chance that I will run away with the ice cream and not pay him, he will close the store and there will be no ice cream sold. That's fundamental. That kind of environment is really, really important. And in some cases, when that environment for some reason is damaged, there is a terrible decline in living standards. The best example that I can give of that is the famous example of what happened in Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So we have hundreds and hundreds of years in which essentially the capability of enforcing contracts and having some kind of legal system that did that, that environment declined very sharply. And as a result, what we see is a sharp decline in trade. It never goes down to zero, by the way. There still is trade. There are traders, moving around, peddlers moving around from village to village and selling people that they couldn't get themselves and still needed. Salt is a good example. So that the salt trade never dies. The wine trade never dies because, you had to bring in wine from the south to the north, things like that. But it becomes a teeny tiny trickle. And then at some point, as institutions get better and there is more of a legal framework and there are more various institutional arrangements that make trade possible, we observe in Europe in what is now known as the commercial revolution, in which trade becomes more and more important. By the 13th century, basically many parts of Europe are what we would call today a commercial economy. And that would involve in Britain, it would involve the Low Countries, large parts of Germany and France. There are shops, there are peddlers, there are markets, there are fairs. People buy things, people sell things. And they know that by and large, the chances of somebody misbehaving and behaving opportunistically, these chances are small. And so they're willing to engage in this. And it makes everybody better. But there are things that we know are very bad for trade. And that includes war, for instance. It includes crime. at a very high level. It includes, other disasters that can happen. And so trade is a natural part of people's behavior, but it needs the appropriate environment. And if that environment doesn't exist, then you have a problem. And so some areas are isolated, or they don't get along with their neighbors, or something like that. And that, I think, precludes trade. Now, what is true is that a lot of people have thought that a commercial economy, for some reason or another, is not a nice place to live in, and I would count a lot of anthropologists, such as Karl Polanyi, into that camp. But an economist, I think, it really fails to understand that, and I think it really, I think it was really driven home to me in my lifetime by comparing the kind of world of communism, which only disappeared, when I was already grown up. You weren't born yet, but communism was with us for many years. And in communism, there was some commerce, but it was highly regulated, controlled. It was extremely, I would say, not unnatural. Okay, and so when a people in the Soviet Union, in one of the satellite countries, came to the West, and I've met people like that, and they would go to a supermarket, and their eyes would pop out, and they said, "Look at all this choice! Look at all the wonderful things I can buy! 50 kinds of breakfast cereal, 100 kinds of sausage, 500 kinds of cheese. I mean, unbelievable." In my country, we can only buy one kind of cheese, and there's only one type of shoes, and and on and on and on. And so, because the institutional environment under communism was really not conducive to commerce nearly as much as in the capitalist democratic West, and obviously that is what people want. I'll give you one example that always sticks into my mind. I had a student who somehow managed to go to Cuba in, I think it must have been the 1980s, but I'm not totally sure when. And so I asked him, so what was Cuba like? And of course, Cuba is not exactly a country that fostered free exchange and, open markets and all that. And he said, "Well, Joel," he said, "I'll tell you this, give you an example of what it means to buy an ice cream in Havana." And he said, "Well, there's two things about that ice cream that sound very good. The first is that it's very, very cheap. And the second is that the portions are huge." And I said, "Well, and what's the downside?" And he said, "Well, for one thing, you have to stand in line for 4 hours before you can get it. And the second is that they only had vanilla." And I think that illustrates, the kind of difference between, a controlled economy and a free market economy, which is that in a free market economy, the prices may be higher, but you don't stand in line very long, and you have a huge choice, which obviously makes the experience very different. And so, I mean, I, like any economist, basically, I like trade, I like markets, I like what we call economic freedom, in the sense that, you have more choices that you can make.
So, as a related follow-up, since this is sort of linked to when I mentioned Professor Tirthankar Roy, the nationalist, the Indian nationalist analysis of British colonial rule sort of said that, all right, there was the imposition of laissez-faire policies in the long run, but that sort of had India specialize in, let's say, commercial production of agrarian products, agricultural products, which weren't that high value, and that after the quote unquote deindustrialization, because there were heavy entry barriers and no native industry protection, you didn't really have capital investment of the kind that could, and the entire motley of arguments that is associated with dependency theorists. So, how do you evaluate dependency theorists, especially with respect to the global south? Because they sort of suspect this exaltation of laissez-faire economics or the commercialism in general.
You're asking me a very complicated question, which really touches upon the whole question of, the colonial episode, or shall we say, or period, in which Europeans, by and large Europeans, went to the what you people call the global south, and colonized it, exploited it, took advantage of it, dominated it, and on and on and on. And so the question is, what kind of effect did this have? And the answer is that, and this is basically what Roy is saying, because I read his books and I know him. And basically he says, look, colonialism did some bad things and it did some good things. And weighing them one against the other is very difficult. And so, particularly, I think the example, it's not my place here to talk to a bunch of people in Delhi and tell them about their own history. But the British Raj did some really awful things to India, and it did some really great things. It educated a large number of elite Indian scientists, engineers, artists, and so on and so forth. Many of them went to England and got educated there. It also built infrastructure in India. It built railroads and it built harbors, and it did, it set up schools. They did all that. And they destroyed the Indian cotton industry by flooding India with cheap British textiles. And so, how do you weigh these against each other is of course very hard to know. In some countries, we actually do know. In some places, colonialism was really awful. I mean, and it's very good, very few redeeming virtues. So, for instance, you look at what the Belgians did in the Belgian Congo, or what the Dutch did in Indonesia, or certainly what the Japanese did in Korea. I mean, these are all cases of ruthless exploitation with very few redeeming values. But if you look, for instance, at the French rule in West Africa, so the French, I mean, they too, they weren't choir boys and they did some awful things, but they basically, provided an education in terms of, engineering, medicine, science, that would have been very difficult for these people to acquire had the French not flown them to France and taught them in French schools. And so until the present day, the languages spoken in previously colonized countries is typically the language of the colonizer. For India, for instance, which speaks 50 languages, without English, it would have been very difficult for for India to function. But the same is true in Africa. In places like Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania, people speak English, and in Mozambique, people speak Portuguese, and in Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire, people speak French, and that language alone is a lubricant that makes the economy work better. So the colonial heritage is and always has been mixed. And for an economist, I think basically saying, was colonialism a good thing or a bad thing, is probably a question that we don't want to pick up. And I think Tindankar is absolutely right, sort of staying away from that. Now, the problem this is more of an issue, I think, in economics department than it is in history department, is the ideology comes in. And in some cases, it's nationalist ideology, as what you were mentioning, and there's other cases, of course, in which that's the case. In other cases, it's much more class oriented. It's basically exploitation. Capitalism is bad. They took advantage of us. For an economist, those questions are not that particularly interesting. It's more interesting in, for instance, uh, um, you know, uh, why did this is something I've been concerned with for a long time. Why do famines disappear in India for many years? I mean, the last famines were in the late 19th century, and then you don't get another famine until 1943 with the Great Bengal famine. So in between, there's 40 years in which there are no famines in India. And good question. Why did that happen? And was it the Brits? Was it markets? Was it this? Was it that? And you basically, what's interesting there is data. And that's what people analyze, and then they process the data, they run regressions, they test things of that nature. What determines the productivity of labor? How does what happens to relative prices between agriculture and industry? There are lots of really good questions that don't require some kind of judgmental approach to history, saying this was a bad thing, this was a good thing. I mean, that's I think that is in some sense a regrettable trend. I'm interested in history not to judge people, but to understand why things are the way they are today. And I'll give you one example. There's a lot of tendency to judge people who lived in the past by calling them racist. And so there's a famous case of the great philosopher David Hume, who got cancelled at a University of Glasgow because David Hume, somewhere in his writings, made a rather nasty remark, which today would have been considered to be seriously racist, about non-white people. I forget exactly what it said, but it is pretty racist. So if somebody said this today, I would call him a racist. But in the 18th century, this was perfectly normal thinking. And things that are sexist and racist and prejudicial, and I mean, that is the way the world was. And judging it by our criteria strikes me as a complete waste of time. And so I don't do that. I mean, I don't judge people. I don't think the world really gains anything for us looking back and said, God, look at all this, anti-Muslim feelings or anti-Semitic feelings, or this, that, or the, I mean, that's, you understand that people in previous times had different values, different criteria, and so, well, fine. So once you admit that, judging them makes no sense, and I'm kind of opposed to that, and I don't think you see a lot of that in economic history. There's always some, but that's not the main thrust. But if you look at what's known as history of capitalism, that is a big part of it, and that makes the history difficult. Give you the most sensitive topic on this, and I'm not going to get into that, but the most sensitive topic about this is American slavery. So the United States, we know, of course, everybody knows, until 1865, there were slaves in the South who ate that. Okay. We all know that, and so some of the historiography basically is all very indignant, and every second sentence they need to use some negative adjective in order to condemn it. And then, many years ago, two people called Vogel and Engerman, I don't know if you know their work, but Vogel and Engerman wrote a book called Time on the Cross, in which they said, well, yeah, we agree that slavery is a bad thing, but let's take a closer look at it and see whether it was bad or good. And one of the things that they argued, which is what an economist would do, is that, of course, slaves were unfree and they had been, and they had certain limitations on what they could do. They couldn't leave their owner, they couldn't get married, da, da, da. But were they starved, for instance? Did they get enough to eat? And Bob and Stan basically said, look, I mean, these people were assets. They were like, and so if you have a car or if you have a tractor or something like that, you're going to make sure that that tractor has enough gas to do its work, and you're going to lubricate, the system, and you're going to maintain it. And you would do the same thing to a slave, not because you're inherently good or bad, but because you invested money in this thing and you want it to perform for you. Now that's, I think, a reasonable approach, but people really took offense, and until the present day, the argument that slave owners did not systematically mistreat their slaves, starve them and beat them, and I mean, it doesn't make sense. That's what Fogelnagel argued. It doesn't make sense for you to beat your slaves to half to death because you're throwing away money. And so this has nothing to do with being good or bad, just being reasonable. And I think that's the kind of debate that economists can have, and historians get often very disturbed about that. There was just a case last year in Florida. I don't know how much of this penetrated to the Indian press, in which they were working on the curriculum in history in Florida, and some historian had pointed out that one of the things that the slave owners did is that when they saw a slave who was particularly, adept and dexterous, they would train that slave to become a carpenter or a blacksmith or in some useful occupation, because that way the slave could make more money for them. But then when the slaves were emancipated in 1865, the people who had been trained as carpenter could actually exercise their trade because they had the skills. That sounds a fairly reasonable proposition to make, and it has some historical beef. It was actually written, as it turns out, by a historian who was himself black, but that's beside the point. But then there was this storm of indignation saying, how can you say that slave owners treated their slaves, well, they didn't treat them well in every dimension because they had enslaved them and they deprived them of their freedom and so on and so forth. But in certain aspects, okay, what makes sense for the slave owner resulted in this kind of behavior. And, saying it didn't happen or it's criminal to even say so strikes me as counterproductive.
So we did encounter the debate on American slavery in our History of USA paper. So it is fortunately still a part of our curriculum. It has not been subjected to any sort of censorship as of now. There are a lot of points, and I feel that we are gradually converging towards the cultural aspect of today's discussion. A couple of let's say antecedents to it that I would like to briefly discuss before we move precisely to that. We've discussed dependency theorists and the sort of ideological nature that is associated, the ideological nature of let's say evaluations of colonialism. And while reading about the different models of let's say the rise of the modern British economy, and one theory that we encountered was Robert Brenner's. And Robert Brenner made the argument that demographic or commercial changes cannot by in themselves cause any structural change in the economy. It is class conflicts and property relations that cause changes. And this is something that you alluded to when you talked about conflicts. Now, such explanations have persisted quite a bit in the Indian approach to, let's say, in Indian historiography, especially of pre-colonial India, where you have modes of production and similar explanations of how conflicts occur. To what extent do you think, in the absence of quantitative data of the kind that you mentioned, wherein it's easier to come up with accurate descriptive pictures, do you think that this leads to the emergence of such normative and ideological distortions of pre-modern history? To what extent is the historian of pre-modern economic history disadvantaged in your experience?
Well, I think we're moving into an age in which disadvantage of earlier stuff, in which there are really no data, because data are collected by agencies that didn't exist in the Middle Ages, say something like that. Not here, not in Europe, not in India, not anywhere. But we are now moving into an age in which economic historians not only collect data, but actually create them. And they don't make them up. But what we are increasingly able to do is get into people's heads and into people's actions from large language models. So just analyzing what was written, combined with increasing reliance on archaeology and other sort of scientific methods, genetics, things like that, we are learning a great deal more about pre-modern societies, if such a thing actually existed, than we thought we knew in the past. And I think I'm very hopeful that if that trend continues, as I think it will, that systems that are basically AI based, like large language models, like linguistic analysis, but also things that are purely physical, analyzing materials of stuff that we find, analyzing skeletons that we dig up, we can learn a great deal more about past societies. There are certain things that are, of course, unknowable, right? What did people say? Has no record. But what they write and what others write about them, and we're using not just descriptions, like Ibn Battuta and people like that who travel around the world, but novels, poetry, looking at art. All of this can be analyzed today in a much greater detail than we could in the past. So I think actually our understanding of past societies is going to be vastly larger in 10 or 20 years. And, this is what my students are doing. I mean, when I was a graduate student, we wouldn't have dreamed about this kind of research. And today it is a reality. And I think it's going to make economic history one of the most exciting fields in the world, largely because, we get access to information that was never even dreamed about in the past. And this goes back all the way to the beginning of humans. I mean, there's all this recent work about the emergence of Homo sapiens from Africa, and people are doing much more careful analysis about how they interacted with other forms of humanity. For instance, the interface between the Homo sapiens coming from Africa and the Neanderthal people who lived in Europe. And it turned out now that genetic analysis shows that it isn't quite true that basically these Europeans, as we believed before, that these Europeans came from Africa and from the Middle East and basically wiped out the Neanderthals. It turned out that they intermarried and they interbred. And, we didn't know that, but genetic analysis makes that possible. That's just one example of the kind of insights that we can get about the past, about eras that we thought we knew nothing about. And so I'm quite excited about what we'll learn about pre-industrial societies and their understanding. Far more than I would get excited by analyzing it along class lines or other ideological lines. I mean, the Brenner was a Marxist. I actually knew him. He was a Marxist. He was a nice man, but he was a Marxist. He believed in things like class conflict and the contrast transition from feudalism to capitalism and things like that. And these really are topics that today we are relatively uninterested in, I think. I mean, classes are maybe less interesting to the economists than inequality of wealth, of income distribution, of access to resources. We're much more interested in things like demography, technology, science, but we have also gotten interested in culture and making really interesting efforts in measuring culture from whatever records we can find. And I think it's fascinating stuff. But I will remind you of what I learned many years ago from a famous economic historian who basically said, that we economic historians, we're like paleontologists. Paleontologists have never seen a dinosaur, but they can reconstruct them from little pieces of bone that they find in the soil, and using a fair amount of theory, from zoology, from anatomy, from physiology, basically say how this little bone can then be extrapolated into creating a whole animal and knowing, roughly speaking, what they look like, more or less. And we are like that in economic history as well. Most of the things we would like to observe, we will not observe. But we find little traces, little bones. And with a bit of economic theory and a little bit of logic and quantitative methods, we reconstruct past societies, and we have a fairly good idea of what they were like.
A very apt analogy, sir.
I didn't make it up. I must say, I learned it from one of the greats of the economic history past. But I'm using it a lot.
Well, intellectual property rights don't apply here.
No. I'm giving other people credit. I mean, this is.
With the recent Nobel Prize in Economics, there have been a lot of there's been a spur of interest in institutions, and I remember coming across Douglas North, who got if I remember correctly, the first Nobel Prize for sort of coming up with new institutional economics. And then we have several other institutionalists since then. One of your students, Avner Greif, if I have named him correctly.
Greif.
Avner Greif, and now Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson. So what sort of differences have emerged in, let's say, the understanding of institutions over the recent decades? What makes this Nobel Prize come now, 3 decades after Douglas North got his Nobel Prize?
Well, so Doug was a close friend, and he never taught me, but he became kind of a role model for me. So he was the first to come to the economics profession and basically say, look, we should pay attention to institutions. And the way he defined institutions, I mean, people can argue about what exactly an institution is. What North felt was that institutions were about the rules of the game. So there are certain rules that society sets about how the economic game is played. And for him, property rights were the main rules of the game that he cared particularly about. Acemoglu and Robinson and Johnson had a slightly different definition of institutions, and they're interested in political power. And the question that they asked, which wasn't so much on North's mind, is, who has power in society to determine the distribution of resources? And that's an institution. I mean, in the United States, for better or for worse, we still believe that the allocation of resources is determined by markets. And there's deviations from that one way or another. So we levy taxes, and there's certain things you can. But roughly speaking, We believe in free enterprise and markets allocating resources. There are other places in which these institutions are set up differently. And of course, the main point that everybody is making, and that's what Doug and Avner and Darren, all these people share, is that the economic success and economic performance depends on the structure of institutions. And so the big book that Acemoglu, Robinson, and Johnson wrote was Why Nations Fail. And in fact, I think the title is misleading because it's also Why Nations Succeed. And I think they point out that, and they have this distinction between inclusive and extractive societies, and especially saying, most societies that ever were extractive in the sense that you have a small layer, a few percentage of the population of noblemen or priests or some other elite who have the power to extract resources from everybody else, largely through violence. Also, a lot of the violence is threatened rather than real. And so societies like that are doomed to poverty. Whereas when societies become inclusive in the sense that, power is much more dispersed, as in democracies, widely defined, those societies tend to be economically more successful. And I think that is an extension of Doug North's view. Doug's view was basically, if you have good property rights and you have a good justice system and people can be expected to keep what they earn, then you give entrepreneurs a chance and people will, create trade, they will innovate, and you'll get a booming economy. And what Acemoglu and his colleagues added to that is you need a distribution of power that does not put all the power into the hands of a small elite. Because the kind of equilibrium that you get in these societies, you get a small elite who extract resources from the rest of the population. They use some of those resources to hire mercenaries, to hire people who specialize in violence, and they control them. And these people keep the rest of the population down and make sure that there are no rebellions. That is what North called sort of a natural society. In this sense, these approaches are quite similar. And so institutions, by those definitions, really work. And my work, if I may just throw in a few sentences, basically throws in a third element. And the element that I emphasize is that certain institutions are conducive to the creation of new useful knowledge, science and technology that are needed if the economy is to grow. And some institutions are more favorable to the growth of science and technology than others. I mean, that sort of seems obvious. If you have, say, as Europe did for many centuries, a set of institutions that repress new knowledge and call it heresy, or blasphemy, or apostasy, there's all these wonderful words that they used to suppress new ideas, then you're not going to get much of that, and there's not going to be economic growth. If you have institutions that encourage and incentivize people to come up with new ideas and reward people who make scientific breakthroughs and give patents to people who come up with inventions, that's a set of institutions that are favorable to science and technology and therefore to economic growth. That's something I think that neither North nor Acemoglu emphasized, but I think are critically important. And that's what I did in my books. And I can talk about this forever, but that is something that is I think really is important. And and so if one prediction, for instance, that theory makes is the difference between how they think about China and how I think about China. So the way people thought about China, particularly North, whom I talked to great lengths about China, basically North said, look, if there's not going to be political freedom, and if there's not going to be open access, and if there's not going to be, and if the government is going to control the population very harshly, there will be, in the end, Chinese growth will peter out. And I said, Doug, as long as they reward scientists and inventors who make breakthroughs, I don't see any reason why that should stop, even if people may be afraid of the government and, at dinner parties talk about, the weather and not talk about politics because they're afraid that if they say something, they'll get themselves into trouble. But that doesn't stop people from doing research on molecular biology or, material science. And the Chinese do it, and they reward people who invent things. And eventually, I think they will continue to succeed. I don't know to what point. But they have now, they never did this, by the way. This is sort of interesting. China never had a system in which they rewarded people who came up with new techniques. So China was, of course, at some point in its history, extremely creative and inventive, but they never had a patent system. They never had intellectual property rights the way we had in the West. And I could talk about why that was, but the fact is that they didn't encourage that. And so no wonder that by 1850, they had fallen behind because the West was making progress and advancing in a range of fields, chemistry, biology, physics, you name it. And the Chinese were not. And the reason is that they didn't encourage this kind. They didn't incentivize it. They wanted stability rather than progress. And that too is a set of institutions that we have to worry about, in addition to the kind of things that these other people are talking about. So yes, I've signed up to the institutional revolution, but I wanted to add my own twist to it.
I'm glad this naturally segued into discussing the role of culture, because that's what all these antecedent topics were meant to converge into. How do you assess let's say, the historiography or the traditional explanations of the Great Divergence, which you alluded to in the previous response? So what's your take on what caused the Great Divergence between China and Western Europe, and the sort of explanations that have been put forth till now?
Well, that is a huge issue, and I've just finished a book about that, and no, but I'll give you one particular aspect that I think really matters, and that doesn't get enough emphasis. And that is that most societies that ever existed seem to have a great deal of respect for the learning of earlier generations. And if you came up with something novel, there was always a concern that you were being disrespectful for the people who came before us. And this is a very general phenomenon. For my own ancestors who were Jewish were very much into that, So if you wanted to know the answer to any questions at all, you went to the ancient scriptures, you went to the Talmud, you went to the Mishnah, and, you'd look and you'd find an answer to your question because everything was written in there. And if there was something written in the Talmud that was patently wrong, you couldn't say it because that was, blasphemy. The same is true, say, for the Quran and the Hadith in Islam. The same was true across many civilizations. And you see the same thing in China with the writing of, say, people like Zhu Qi and other Confucian philosophers. And so that, I think, is almost a fixed point in human culture, that we tend to think that the people who came before us knew more than we do. And one cultural change that happens in Europe in the sort of very early modern age, maybe around 1500, maybe a little bit before, is that starts to evaporate. It starts to disappear, and people become increasingly critical of what they have learned from earlier civilizations, which is mostly people like Aristotle and and Galenus in medicine, and Aristotle in a whole bunch of fields, and of course Hipparchus and Ptolemy and all these sort of ancient Hellenistic and Greek writers who described the world, and which in the Middle Ages were still taught at all universities and taught to everybody. And by 1500, you start seeing people who basically become increasingly critical and eventually disrespectful of the traditional knowledge. So the classic case that everybody knows about is Copernicus, right? So Copernicus basically said, what the ancients told isn't true. The Earth isn't the center of the universe, the sun is, right? But this was heresy, and he was really worried before he published it, so that's a wonderful story. But even Galileo, famously was taken to court and, accused of heresy. So there is resistance to this. But the interesting thing is the resistance eventually disappears. By 1700, this game is over, man. I mean, Newton had described the universe in ways that the ancients couldn't have imagined. And from there on, basically, you can see the West sort of rolling on and on and on. And eventually, you get people like Lavoisier who revises chemistry, and you get people who, like Kelvin who revises physics. I mean, field after field after Darwin, you think about field after field, people come and say, what you thought you knew is all rubbish. And I'm smarter than the people came before. So this is a huge step forward. We don't actually think of it in those terms, because in our own society, basically everything was said 10 years ago in science is now obsolete, right? So we have no respect whatsoever for the learning of earlier generations. Nobody teaches history of science in the science department. Nobody's teaching a history of medicine in medical schools. I mean, what the heck? You want to know the newest stuff. You don't want the old stuff. But that is not what happens through most of history. So this cultural change by which Europe sheds its the iron grip of past learning, that I think is a major factor in the great divergence. And China never goes through that. There are some people who try it and it doesn't work. I mean, we can go into the details why it doesn't work, but it doesn't. The time that China, and in a different way Japan, wake up and drop the learning of the past is because the West is showing up on their doorstep, and they realize full well that if they don't change, eventually they'll end up being colonialized the way, say, India was, or Indonesia. And they don't want that. And so eventually, first Japan much earlier, and then eventually China, eventually basically adopt this sort of approach to past learnings, and adopt essentially Western science and technology. But the great change happens, in my view, around that time, in which people slowly but certainly start dropping their, paralyzing, I would almost say, their paralyzing respect to the learning of earlier generations. And I find that an extraordinarily cultural development, and one that happens nowhere else. It only happens in Europe. It only happens in parts of those parts of Europe that we think of as sort of Western Europe, where the Industrial Revolution began, and where much of modern science emerged. And it emerges because of that, because they are willing. I'll give you one sort of really striking example. The most holy book in the Christian world is the Bible. No question about it, right? I mean, everybody can agree on that. And so, and there's always that you can't argue with the Bible, because the Bible is the word of God. And you can't argue with God. That's why he's God and you're not. Well, at some point in the late 17th century, we see something emerging called biblical criticism, in which the assumption is the Bible was written by people, not by God, and it is full of contradictions. It is full of nonsense. It is full of, bloody stories that make no sense, and, horrible things. And we get more and more of a biblical critique, and Spinoza is one of the great figures in that, but there are others. And eventually, this whole idea of biblical criticism, which the religious establishment is horrified by this. The word blasphemy and apostasy are bandied around all the time, but the fact is they can't stop it. And the Bible is subject to more and more scrutiny and linguistic analysis, and some of it's, if you look at the Old Testament, some of it's written in different languages, some of it in Aramaic, some of it in Hebrew, and the style changes, and the whole image of God is very different if you look at the book of Genesis and if you look at the books of Job, say, or something like that, right? So people start understanding that this is written by people, and it's not written by the same people. It was written over hundreds and hundreds of years, and they tried to date it, and they tried to compare it, and so you see this sort of logical analysis of something that is really sacrosanct, and that's a huge step forward. But that's a willingness to sort of examine things that used to be holy cows and say, no, listen, this is something that we should understand and not just adulate. And that's a good example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. The equivalent of the Bible in science is Aristotle. So Aristotle was, really sort of the be-all and end-all of all knowledge in much of the Middle Ages. And as late as the 16th century, if an Oxford Don would teach anything that's contradictory to what Aristotle writes, he would be fined 5 shillings. That gives you an idea of how Aristotle was veneered and adulate at that time. And by 1700, basically everybody understands that the vast bulk of what he wrote is just wrong. I can give you many examples of this. Galileo proved his physics wrong, but people like Reddy, for instance, show Aristotle. For instance, give you one example which I particularly like. So there's a question of what's known as spontaneous generation. So if you have good soil, okay, and you water it, Aristotle said, and you get spontaneous generation of plants. Plants will grow from it. And so a bunch of Italians basically sort of said, well, if there are no seeds in it, okay, but the soil is fertile, we water it, will something grow? And Aristotle said, yes. Well, they tried it, and nothing grew. Surprise, surprise. For us, this is obvious, but it wasn't at that time, because Aristotle said, no, plants will generate spontaneously. And these guys said, no. You need the soil to be good, you need the soil to be watered, but you also need a seed. If there's no seed, you don't get no plant. Right? You don't look surprised. I'm not surprised. Nobody is surprised. But in 1650, this is what still everybody believed because Aristotle said it. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
There's one final question before we'll see if there's any questions from the floor. How does one determine cause and effect relationships in such a case? Because the momentous transformation that you have just described so eloquently, where did it come from? How has it come from in different societies? How did it come from the West? And what drives such an propensity for intellectual questioning?
Well, that's another huge question. My sense is that a lot of this sort of question about causation needs to take into account that there is a huge element of contingency, and that not everything that happened had to happen, and not everything that could have happened happened. So there are a lot of scenarios which I can describe to you in which this didn't happen. So to some extent, there is a contingency element in there. I can write fairly easy rewrites of European history in which the development I just described to you would not have happened. And so accident, I don't want to say accident is too strong, but certainly contingency plays an important role. I'll give you one example that I think mattered here, and to think how to think about it. So the most conservative element in European culture, in the Middle Ages as well as later on, is the Christian church. No question about it, okay? The Christian church is conservative, they protect their turf, and Aristotle becomes part of the Christian doctrine thanks to the writing of St. Thomas, who combined Christian doctrine with Aristotelian philosophy. That's the great. Now, the Christian church is slowly getting weaker in the 14th and 15th century. There's a schism, there's a great deal of corruption, there are lots of, secular rulers who become more powerful than religious authorities, and on and on and on. So in the beginning of the 15th century, they are still quite strong, and they're able to suppress various groups that are in some way or another critical of them. By the beginning of the 16th century, they're sufficiently weak that they can't stop that anymore. And so on the one hand, you get people like Luther and Calvin who are rebelling against the Christian doctrine, but you get in parallel people who are rebelling against scientific, philosophical, and other schools. And now, had the Christian church been reformed in the, say, 15th century and become as powerful as it was in the 12th century, this might not have happened. And I would alternatively say, look, think about why this didn't happen in China. So one of the main reasons that it didn't happen in China is that in 1644, there is an overthrow of the Ming dynasty, eventually replaced by the Qing dynasty, who were Manchurians. And the Manchurians are very conservative, very reactionary, in part because they are thought of be as usurpers, and they wouldn't, Now, was that overthrow of the Ming inevitable? The answer is, of course, not. I mean, there were a few incompetent emperors, and bad decisions that are being made, and it gave you get a peasant rebellion, tack, and eventually you get the Manchus or the Qing. And so my sense is that to some extent, these contingent events mattered. At the same time, of course, we always have to keep in mind that what drove Europe, both at an earlier time and later time, is the competition between European nations with each other that really made it very costly, not to strive to change things because the other guys who were always threatening us may get ahead of us and get stronger than we are. That's a sort of standard story about the greatness of European fragmentation, which people have been writing about now for centuries. And I think that's important, but it isn't enough. Okay, you have to have the right environment, and you have to be lucky. And Europe is lucky. And I hope I don't sound Eurocentric if I say that the history of Europe is different from the history of all other civilizations. Okay, I mean, you look at the three great Asian civilizations, right? The Muslim Middle East, the in South Asia, combination of Hindu and Muslim, India and what is today Pakistan, and China, Japan. And of those four civilizations, West, Middle East, India, China, only the West, basically came up with the ideas and the knowledge that drove the other three forward eventually. And so one would think that this is the exception, and that there were sort of unique circumstances in the West that came together at just the right time. And it's perfectly possible for this not to have happened. And I can point you to books that basically, sort of, I say, counterfactual history that point out that, for instance, suppose that in Europe the Catholic Church had been able to successfully repress the Reformation, and that Catholic reactionary Jesuit priests would have suppressed the progress of knowledge. Well, then Europe would have been probably, where, Myanmar is today or something like that. I mean, so yeah, accident does play a role, and I keep telling this to my students, first lecture, not everything that happened had to happen. Economists distinguish between sort of ex ante probabilities, right? So, when we throw a dice, and before you throw it, there's a 1 in 6 chance that 6 comes up. You throw the dice and you see 6. You say, you see 6 is inevitable. No, wasn't inevitable. There's such a thing as, ex ante probabilities. And my sense is that when you look at causation, it's maybe more useful, as Hume taught us, to think about it as a set of probabilities, and that the realization of the world is one of, millions and millions of different possible outcomes, and that why one came out is it's not quite random the way you throw a dice. I mean, there are obvious geographical and demographic and other factors that bias the outcome in one day of an action, but nothing is ineluctable. Nothing is, engraved in stone. That's very important to realize. And so, in that sense, our whole discussion of causality need to be tempered by the importance of contingency. There's the analogy that I like to make is you think about life. So evolution has created modern life. But there is nothing inevitable about evolution. Lots of it is, contingency, beginning from, of course, the great asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. I mean, you think about it. If that asteroid had been, 10,000 miles to the left or to the right, it may have missed the planet and we would all still be dinosaurs. We might still be having this conversation, but we'd need, a bigger room. All right. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
It did certainly answer that question. Now, I think Anshu has a question. I have unmuted him from the floor. Question from the floor. Anshu, go ahead.
Yeah. Professor Mokyr, your conversation with my very good friend Pushkar here just reminded me of Professor Deirdre McCloskey. She's kind of mentioned, right. She's mentioned like how bourgeois values played an important role and were central to the great enrichment and so forth. I just wanted to add what I could infer from your discussion here with Pushkar is that given your broader cultural evolutionary model, how do you place bourgeois values? How do you think that was contingent on cultural shifts in Europe?
I do think these two things are complementary. I've been with Deirdre for many years now, and I've read all her books before she published them, and so I know her stuff well. So she and I think basically agree that we have slightly different approaches, but the two are complementary. I think the difference between her and me are that, you're absolutely right. I mean, these bourgeois values and the sort of belief that making money and engaging in economic success, if you want, okay, that is a good thing. That's a virtuous thing. That's an ethical, moral thing, which is not obvious, okay? And so that kind of belief pushes us forward, because if you live in a world in which everybody who makes money is suspected to have stolen it or exploited others or achieved it in some bad way, that is probably a bad world in which you see an unlikely world for which you think capitalism to emerge. My emphasis is slightly different. My emphasis is on what I call upper tail human capital, because I am particularly interested in the clever people who come up with new technology and who come up with the science that creates more new technology. And that's a much smaller part of the population. It does not include the merchants, and it does not include the lawyers, and it does not include, it includes people who experiment. It includes people who observe. It includes people who calculate. And that's a very small proportion of society. You should figure that it's a society in which maybe 10% of all men, women is even worse, but 10% of all men could even read. And of those, how many of them knew mathematics? How many could read Isaac Newton or, Descartes or anything like that? So this is a small group of people, but they are pivotal. Now, they invent things, they make things, they build things. And then, of course, you need to live in a society, and that's where her work comes in, which approves of this. And that, when somebody like Richard Arkwright, who invented this sort of spinning machinery that made the English cotton industry take off, okay? So somebody like that is widely respected in his society, becomes a country gentleman, and people come to him and they love him and they treat him like royalty. Or somebody like James Watt, even more so. Watt, was another inventor, and he was venerated in his time. People really thought he became a celeb, as you would call it today. And that, I think, is the sort of complementary part to the story of that I'm telling. But her idea that society has to create a culture in which making money and getting rich is good for you and good for society, that these are not contradictory, means the shedding of a zero-sum game view of society. To say, if I get rich, that does not mean that you get poor by definition. Now that's a big step forward. And I think that's what's underlying her idea of bourgeois culture. And I'm totally in agreement with that. It's not my approach. I emphasize other things, but the two approaches don't contradict each other. Is that reasonable? Does that sound reasonable to you?
Yes, Professor.
Good. Thank you.
As a final note, before we end this discussion of ours, because we are almost nearing the 90-minute mark, just wanted to ask your take on Gregory Clark's work.
Whose work?
Gregory Clark.
Gregory Clark. Yes. What about his work?
His work that, like we were just discussing about high-end capital and so forth. So just wanted to ask your opinion on, because he's also worked on some of those areas, I believe.
So there's two things that Greg has done many things, and his book Farewell to Alms, which was published now 15 years ago. It's actually published in a series I'm editing, so I know it well, and I've taught it, and so it's a very interesting and original approach to history, by emphasizing essentially how Malthusian mechanisms kept society down for thousands of years, because whenever there was some kind of growth in productivity or economic progress, population grew, and then diminishing returns set in, and you went back to where you were before. And so this is an argument that he shares, of course, with others. So Oded Gallo, for instance, makes the same argument, and many other people make it before that. And I think the profession hasn't quite disavowed this, but it's also true that there are other factors that Greg did not give enough attention to. And so we could debate this. But what makes Malthusian models more complicated as a whole set, I actually spent 2 hours teaching this, which I'm going to do next week, actually, as it turns out. But basically, these Malthusian models are very simplistic, and once you start making them more complicated, it turns out that you could have multiple equilibria, for instance. So Voss and Voigtlander, for instance, have a paper in which they point out, quite reasonably, that urbanization tends to mess a Malthusian model up. The other thing that I associate with Greg, and he won't deny that, is his work on intergenerational mobility, which is, he wrote a book called The Sun Also Rises, Sun, S-O-N, yes? And in which he points out that when you take all kind of really clever measures of intergenerational mobility, you actually see there's a huge amount of stickiness and that if you were born a member of the elite and you were born rich and you were well educated, okay, that the likelihood that your children would be like you is very high. In fact, it's like 0.8. And what he finds is that 0.8 is fairly constant among various societies. And he thinks that this is some kind of general rule about intergenerational mobility. And I don't disagree with that. I'm not totally sure that it holds for all society at all times. I can imagine in some societies for a variety of reasons, it will be lower and higher, but he finds it's almost constant, which is, I think, fascinating. But here, look, I mean, I respect Greg a great deal. He's an incredibly interesting, I mean, in a way, maybe put it this way, the reason economic history is so much fun is exactly because it gives an opportunity to people like Gregory Clark and Deirdre McCloskey and Joachim Voss and Bob Allen to come up with really interesting ideas. And these ideas, some of them will, survive the test of time and some of them won't, but they're always fun to talk about. And in a way, the conversation itself may be as interesting as the fact that whether we reach a conclusion at the end of the story or not. Just exchanging the ideas and making us think about the past in those terms is what makes this worthwhile. I mean, remember one thing, and that is we are the only species on this planet that is interested in its own history. Other species are intelligent. My dog is intelligent. Dolphins are intelligent. Whales are intelligent. But they do not study the history of dogs or dolphins, as far as anybody knows. We do. That sets us apart as a species. And it's endlessly fascinating. Why should we study history? That's because we are the only species who does, and because it happened.
Well, that I think was a very powerful note to end on. Thank you, Professor Mokyr, for your time. I'd also like to thank Pushkar for the wonderful moderation as well. To announce, just for a small announcement to everyone here, thank you all for joining here for us tonight. Before I hand it over to Rajneesh, I just wanted to mention that we are also hosting Professor Peter Betke from the Marquette Center on 13th. So do stay tuned on that.
I know Peter is going to be great fun.
Yes, exactly.
And he and I disagree about almost everything, but he's great fun to talk to.
Right. Okay.
All right.
With that, I'll hand it over to Rajneesh for a formal vote of thanks, and that'll be.
I had a wonderful time. Thank you, Pushkar. Thank you, everybody, and please stay well. And a happy New Year to all of you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Bye-bye.